Hello, class, and welcome to week 15. So this is the final lecture you'll be getting. It's the final week. We're going to talk about anthropology and time, kind of pose some general anthropological kind of purpose questions. So research papers are due uh, December 1st, 11:59, and then the final exam will come online, and then you'll have the full week to complete the final exam, at which time then you will get a completed grade. Um, if you have not finished all of your uh, makeup work, remember you can get half credit if you turn in stuff really late. Um, if you have not done that, you're going to want to do that by December 1st, because I will no longer accept late work after the research paper due date of December 1st. All right, that's the housekeeping. Again, any questions, comments, concerns, please email or call the office. So the anthropology of time, this is another one of those things. I think that, a general theme in anthropology is that culture kind of controls everything in terms of how we think, the language that we use to think, our religious ideology, our political ideology, the way that we use material culture, tools, technology, how we get our food. All of that stuff is going to be dominated really by culture. And time, in terms of a concept that we use, is also determined by our culture. And there's some different kind of theoretical orientations around time itself. So, the big question kind of for the week is why we divide time the way that we do. Religion and magic kind of gives us like control and power over some of those things. And remember, as hunter-gatherers, we didn't really sacrifice things in the name of kind of controlling the weather or gods or whatever else. So this is coming about. Religion, magic, and control and power is coming much like is becoming much more prevalent when we get into civilization. And this is also when we get into calendars. So calendars, they don't measure time; they give it a rhythmic form, right? So really, in terms of calendars, this is why leap year and some of those other things are thrown off, or that we use daylight savings time. We're manipulating it and giving it a rhythmic form, and that's calendars is part of that as well. American culture and control of time and the lack of control. The idea of live for today but plan for tomorrow is very American, and it gives us a future tense. We do a lot of future tense in our society and culture. We constantly ask little kids what they want to be when they grow up. And this is really kind of moving towards that planning for tomorrow aspect. And then, culturally, there's some balance there, right? Like, do you go just use your credit cards to buy what you want to be happy in the moment, or do you, save and plan for tomorrow? And so I would say that there's kind of a balance, and this kind of depends on the economy and generational, right? Like, my grandparents living through the Depression, living for today was never their option, right? Like culturally, they planned for tomorrow constantly, right? Because they didn't know if they were gonna, the whole growing up and saving rice, and they didn't know about food and the next meal and all of those things. Durkheim breaks time up into some interesting ways. One is personal time, and personal time is basically the subjective or stream of consciousness. So, like when we are alone and we're kind of thinking on our own, that's our own personal time. And then we kind of control what we do with that time in that personal level. Social time is really where we're going to start to get into this cultural concept, is cognizable units that impose themselves on all minds, right? So then we get into like work time is going to be related to that. That's going to come a little later. But work time is part of social time, right? Like the 9 to 5 job, the waking up in the morning, going to work, 5 days a week, those kinds of things are all been implemented. Now, remember, prior to the progressive era, we didn't have an 8-hour workday and we didn't have a 40-hour work week. It was much longer than that. So the work calendar and social time was more impactful. Malinowski's idea of time reckoning coordinates activities and dating events and gauges the length of time spans. So this is kind of looking at indigenous groups, and really time was based on when their festivals, when their ceremonies, when their rituals were happening, right? So if they celebrated the uh, solstices and the equinoxes, which are kind of four of the big components of seasonality, this would have been a time reckoning piece because you would have had ceremonies around those kind of aspects of time. Evans Pritchard kind of combined them and both had like time reckoning in terms of perceived relation to activities and also rhythms of basic activity cycles like natural cycles, seasons, and cattle movements. So he kind of added to this time reckoning piece of, yes, it's also this rhythmic part of activities, but it's also seasonal as well. Ecological time spacing and time is also part of this Evans Pritchard. An environment and interdependence on different groups. So this ecological component is like how humans interact with nature around them. So really, then we become kind of dependent on nature and the cycles of nature in terms of food, and then we create kind of rituals and ceremonies around that aspect of basic needs. Gertz basically proposes a much more kind of intersubjective process, which creates a true temporal experience. The idea of being living in the moment, so that if we're experiencing each other, like even in ritual or ceremony, if we're hanging out with each other, that interdependence kind of conversation around time and us spending time together is really where Gertz kind of gets into this intersubjectivity piece around time. And it's a fascinating idea that really what's dependent is that we have each other and time to spend with each other that makes the whole time component even have value, right? If we were alone somewhere, time starts to lose its place. And time is a fascinating piece, and this intersubjectivity kind of leads me off to some interesting conversations around things. I remember that, you know, when you kind of leave family, and it's sad when you first move out or you move away, like we did to Korea. People can get kind of resentful, and it's not that they're necessarily mad at you because they don't want to hold you back in terms of, you know, you got laid off from work, you're struggling, you get a job somewhere other place. They want you to be successful, but there's this level of connection that they know is going to disappear, and it's absolutely in this kind of Gertzian kind of idea around intersubjective process of time and how spending time with each other actually gives value to time and space itself. So, you know, when we moved to Korea, we definitely had a bunch of friends who were you could tell that they were angry every time we came back and visited. They were happy to see us, but they were kind of like, you abandoned us. And it's not that we left the space; it's that we no longer spent the time together. And that the longer that you're apart, and that disconnection from intersubjective time kind of rationale, the longer that you're apart, the more it's possible for you to kind of start to let those relationships kind of fade. So this is the fear, like it's a natural fear among human beings that if you do separate, that you won't maintain that same close tie. And it's very real. There's no like way around it. This is people get upset around like moving to different locations, but also, you know, when you start to hang out with a different friend group more than another group, because now as you age, you start to kind of have different interests and jobs and everything else. And so then the old friend group, you don't have as much in common, so you don't see them as often. So then they're jealous because you have this new friend group. So really it has less to do, according to Gertz, this has less to do with the people and the expectations and maybe even the role that you play, but more about the time and the intersubjective kind of spending of that time, and that sharing of space through that time deal, right? I mean, and at the end of the day, if we do like internally know that we all are on this kind of biological clock and eventually it ends and we pass away, then spending time with each other actually has this value of giving it meaning, right? Like if I'm willing to spend my living breath with another individual, then to them that's showing that there's an investment there and that they could do the same thing. But in that sharing, there's a moment, right? Like we live together. we spent this time together, which is a very valuable component if we all know that we're going to basically pass away. So this kind of time reckoning and this intersubjective spending of time is a fascinating component to the whole conversation around anthropology and what we do with time, right? Many languages lack the future tense, and I've provided a short video. I think that it's really good. A lot of them don't have a past tense or a future tense, so this live for today is kind of really the real way that people are living through language, especially with this time concern. Applying Sapir-Whorf hypothesis means that you live in the present and the past if you lack the future tense. And again, in America, we don't like the future tense. We actually we utilize the future tense almost more than the present, right? Like we justify a lot of things into the future so that we don't have to really deal with the present. We say things like things that get better, or they always work themselves out, or the grass is greener on the other side. These are all like kind of future tense space concepts. Control and governance over time in the calendar. It gives control over the way and when society moves. This is movement. So when governments and industrialized nations start to create calendars and start to create things like holidays and start to employ things like the train, now we have to keep track of time in order to move the way that we want to move in this kind of efficient way. So this is a fascinating kind of piece in terms of the calendar and control, and how much society's kind of use of calendar can control things. In this vein, a lot of times when new governments come into control, the first thing they do is implement new holidays, because you're basically symbolically giving back time to the people, and it gets you a lot more support if you give time back to people. Missionaries push the Gregorian calendar on indigenous peoples and really completely change the way of life. Control over time, control equals control over. So the Gregorian missionaries, when they show up, church is on Sunday. Well, in reality, like before that, Native and indigenous groups, in terms of a day of the week, there was no like week, right? Like time would have been divided between your equinoxes and your solstice, right? Like when those dates are. Those are your ceremonies and your festivals, and you might keep track of days here and there, but a Sunday through Monday calendar is just that's not how people lived or thought about things. But now, if you implement this on a group of people, now you can tell them things like, no, look, here's your calendar. You work Monday through Saturday, and you go to church on Sunday. And then they start forcing people to do this, and now you've completely changed people's way of life, right? Instead of going through personal time where I'm like going and gathering acorns and I'm like kind of in my own space in terms of time, it's a much more controlled mechanism, which you will work these days, right? And then you will go to church this day. And you've completely wiped out people's way of life just in time management. And that's really kind of the way things work, have worked in this kind of colonial imperial era for sure. Commodification of time or work time, control over daily activities in society. This is what we operate on as work time, right? Like if you don't have to wake up to an alarm clock, power to you. That is definitely a piece of this kind of cultural control over time. It's one that I struggle with. I feel like we all should struggle with it, because I also feel like that it's not supernatural for humans to be operating in this way. Yeah, we live longer, we have modern medicine, but I would say that the things like stress and depression and anxiety, these are all illnesses of civilized or industrial nations development. Back in the day when we didn't have this kind of control over time, we had much more freedom with our personal time. We didn't have those issues. And I think a lot of it has to do with this whole time management, work time piece. So we just used to have much more freedom in terms of our own time, and our own, the way we spent time with each other was much more valuable and less contrived, right? If you now have to go to work, now and at certain times now you're creating these relationships that were not necessarily there in past times. So work time is definitely an important piece in terms of looking at our own society.